of turning off when it doesn't hear anything. Go ahead, Kelly.
Well, I was just going to say, because there's obviously carers already involved, to involve them, speak with them.
Yeah. So carers could give you some idea of her health needs and her ability. Yeah, that would be a start. But is there anything specific you'd like to know more about? So if you, Kelly, if you were talking, I'm going to go to Mike and then I'll come back to anybody else. Go ahead, Mike. Oh, Mike.
You're muted.
I think you're muted, Mike.
Sorry about that. Yeah, what always strikes you when you look at a picture like that is you're seeing an older lady. And what we tend to forget is that she's 75. So in 1968, she would have been in her teens or her 20s. So she was part of an entirely different, culture and society. And it's quite reasonable to ask about things like drug use, alcohol use, what's gone on in her past.
Yeah.
Mustn't stick with that stereotype of the old lady.
Yeah, she actually worked for 35 years in the sales office of a factory in Tipton. So she worked in a factory in Tipton for 35 years in sales. Her husband was a foreman on the shop floor of this factory. So they both had a professional life they shared. She had a long career. She was dealing with quite complex business decisions and business for the company. So yeah, she's not a 75-year-old, old lady. She's somebody who's had a full life, who's had a son, who's got a granddaughter. Yeah. Somebody called Hales, Hales. I can't see what your surname is.
Hello there. Yes, it's Andrea Hales. Hello.
Oh, hello.
Hello there. I was thinking, we said Christine said she's not coping. Is she able to tell us a little bit more? I'm thinking coping could mean trouble getting dressed, which I'd assume the carers would be looking after.
Yeah.
Is it that meals are not being prepared? Some of that would be, I guess, looked after by the carers. Medications. Has she done anything that is dangerous, like left the cooker on? Has she been wandering out of the house, finding herself lost? Is it memory? So I wonder if Christine could tell us a little bit more about what is not coping specifically.
Yes, absolutely. So Christine is really concerned first that Edith is seriously depressed, anxious, and in Christine's own judgment, not looking after herself. She's got, in her view, increasing memory issues, and she needs prompts and reminders. Christine's example would be that she recently got lost in town and she couldn't remember who was picking her up or how she was getting home. She's, says Christine, lost weight in her view over the last year and often talks about wanting to die and be with Wilf. Her problem is that although the carers are attending Edith, Edith specifically has told the carers not to discuss her care with Christine, her granddaughter, and therefore she understands very little on what the carers recognise as being Edith's needs.
Got Teresa.
So does that help?
Thank you. Yes, I think that helps a lot. And so there's probably, I think, a bit of conflict. There's quite a lot then that Christine's probably picking up on, which Edith doesn't want her to know. And I guess my question is it that Edith just doesn't want Christine to worry? Is it that Christine and her don't have an amazing relationship? Is Christine actually a problem for Edith? Is that something we should be concerned about? Or is Edith just trying to get along and doesn't want her granddaughter to know she needs help?
Yeah, and so that is so crucial when you're talking about her emotional well-being and her social life. It's understanding that. And Teresa wanted to come in.
Hi, yeah. I think what I would like to know is just, it says her granddaughter Christine visits, but it doesn't mention whether Jim visits. So I'm just wondering, what's the relationship like with Jim?
Okay, so you, Teresa, you picked up on a very important point, because there is a central problem here, which we wouldn't find out unless we considered the broader picture. Her son has got really very little patience with his mum. He's always clashed. If you ask Jim, he would say he clashed with her because he felt she bullied her father right up until he died. He doesn't carry out care responsibilities, and there are tensions with Christine, his daughter, who berates him, I think, and is angry about his attitude to his mum. He states he's unable to assist his mum financially, but won't assist her seeking equity release on her property, which she says she wants to do. So his mum wants to release some of the capital in her property, but he's either preventing her doing it or at least not facilitating that. So that's Jim. There's tension with his daughter over his mum, and tension with his mum that is historic tensions by the sounds of it. Okay, I hope we're all getting the sense of how this is going to work. There are a few more things that I know would be useful. Denise.
Yeah, I was going to ask a question about a housing situation, but now you've mentioned equity release. She obviously owns her own property, and I suppose there's two things really. One about it says the family home, so I'm assuming that property is quite substantial for one person, and is that some of the issues she's got of coping in a fairly large property? And then the other one is, now you've mentioned the equity release. It'd be good to know what she wants that equity release for. Is it so she can go on cruises and enjoy her life and whatever, or is somebody else after that money?
Good point. Always think the unthinkable. Consider a possibility that she could be exploited by somebody else. Absolutely. I'm going to tell you a bit about her medical history, but the next point we're going to do is talk to the GP, get the GP's perspective. But she's experienced low mood, depression and anxiety for a number of years, but has no formal diagnosis. It's Melina's point, is she got mental ill health? Well, she's definitely been depressed or anxious, but we'll see. But this is important. She had cancer in the lower bowel in 2017 and is currently in remission. But she suffers from severe rheumatoid arthritis and has poor mobility. And that's why she has carers coming in morning and night. Okay. So that's a bit of health background, but we're going to speak to the GP in a moment. Okay. So we know that she's got memory issues. We know she could be confused. We should be thinking about capacity, but not in this totally irrelevant discussion that people sometimes say, has she got capacity? Whenever you're thinking capacity, you should be thinking, for what? For what specific decision do we need to know she has capacity? Because saying somebody does or doesn't have capacity means very little unless you link it to a decision. I'm going to give you one more bit of information. Now imagine how important it would be to know this and how likely it is that we wouldn't. If we asked the right question, we'd know that she worked for 35 years. What happened when you retired, Edith? What happened with Wilf? Because he got chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. Was that from work? And it turns out that when he fell ill after retirement, he commenced a legal action for compensation, arguing that his chronic obstructive pulmonary disease was due to poor working conditions. Okay. But before the case could be settled, the company went into liquidation and Wilf had no one to claim against. Both his and Edith's work pensions were affected by the company going into liquidation, and in later years, they relied mostly upon ill health benefits and state pensions. I'm not exaggerating to say there are lots of men and women in Edith's age group who experienced that kind of thing happening in the Black Country when businesses went bump. They lost pension rights, they lost stability.
I hadn't realised Deb had gone for a while because she's got a problem with her IT. And I'm conscious that Gillian and Zoe had also made comments if you want to. Okay, so Gillian was saying that I have builders in, so I can't unmute, sorry, I won't share that too much. I would be curious about her relationship with her son, which I think we've covered, but you are right to probe deeper there. What her marriage was like, what kind of things she was involved in the household before her husband passed away, e.g. paying bills, that kind of management. Does she have any hobbies, interests in finishing work? What exactly is it that she's not coping with, which I think we've covered that one. Is it that she isn't coping, or is her granddaughter finding it a challenge supporting her? She's bereaved. Has she had any support for that? Absolutely. And Zoe mentions, has she been reviewed for depression, memory, screening of that nature? And then Erica says, assess her mental capacity. Sorry, assess, I think you mean her mental capacity. Is she able to make decisions about her care and support? Does she understand? Can she retain the information, which we will look at shortly? And Kelly, asset rich but low income. And I think, I don't know if you've just covered that point.
Yeah, she has. I think we've covered that. I think Andrea wanted to come back in on the microphone.
Yeah, sorry, that's okay. I was just wondering, is Jim her only child?
Yeah.
And oh, okay, thank you. It sounds like we are concerned about her memory quite rightly. At any point before her memory got to this point, had she and her family done anything about maybe a legal power of attorney for health and welfare or her estate, perhaps?
Yeah, no, is the sad truth. And lasting power of attorney for health and finances is crucial. But unfortunately, neither Christine nor Jim has got that ability to make decisions for her or help her with her decision making if she loses capacity. So we have that problem. But if she and Wilf were engaged in a fruitless legal battle to get what they believed was that they were owed, and she now is financially struggling, what implication might that have on her relationship with professionals when she meets them? How might she be feeling? You can't be sure, but I suspect she might be frustrated, distrustful, and angry with.
Debbie says angry, untrusting, and then a lot of people are coming in with distrustful kind of sentiments.
You would understand her reaction when she's been given advice about finances, when she feels she's been let down by the system, or that she, after years of working life, is struggling when she never planned to be. You know, depression and anxiety have a root, and it's hard always to find them. So let's go to the next slide, which is her GP, who will fill us in a bit more. There's a lot on this slide, so I'll read it all out. And then I'm going to give you a moment or two to think about what you think's relevant. Mrs. Morris has been registered at the practice for 20 years. Now, she suffered bowel cancer and needed a permanent stoma and colostomy bag. She struggled at first with self-care and was supported by district nursing. She takes methotrexate for arthritis, but has developed carpal tunnel syndrome. Her arthritic flare-ups are increasing, and Edith suffers chronic pain. She needs regular physio, but she kept cancelling her sessions and told me she couldn't get to hospital pain management service, even though they would arrange transport to their clinic. Edith's recent health review looked at memory and alcohol consumption, but our practice nurse feels she's not being open about her alcohol consumption when she says she only drinks to help her sleep. Importantly, last month, she was taken to hospital by ambulance after what Edith said was an accidental overdose of painkillers. ED stated that she had consumed a significant amount of alcohol. Her granddaughter revealed Edith often expresses suicidal thoughts, but Edith denied this when psychiatric liaison tried to address it with her. So our discharge letter recommended referral to community mental health team, but they said that we should refer her to improved access to psychological therapies, IAPT as it's called. Okay, so I'm going to give everybody 2 or 3 minutes to scribble down some things that you think are significant understanding and things that are going to impact on pies, on the social, physical, intellectual abilities. So we'll come back to that in a moment.
And some people are putting their comments into the meeting chat, which is fine. Deb back, just out of interest.
I think so. Oh, there she is. Yeah, so.
Oh, she's back. Yeah, she's back.
I am back, Son, but I can't that.
I was just wondering, Deb, if you were back or whether you were still struggling with your connection.
Yeah,
No.
Andrea's made. Okay, so folks, let's look at that. If we understand her health conditions, we might have a better understanding of the kind of things that are impacting on her care. Okay, so would somebody like to suggest the things that Zoe, you're saying, why couldn't she attend the pain management? Is she having issues changing the stoma bag due to her arthritis and carpal tunnel? Self-care is going to be difficult if she's got rheumatoid arthritis and carpal tunnel syndrome. That's going to mean her ability to do that fine detail is going to be compromised as well. So that's going to be significantly one to take into account. But why, we ask ourselves, is she not going to hospital pain management? Because if her depression is being fueled by this chronic pain, it overpowers you all the time. Kelly, yeah, Mike.
I was just going to comment from my point of view, looking at the alcohol. One of the things you see is that people don't engage with medicine because they're concerned that doctors or nurses are going to tell them to stop drinking. So there's that kind of fear.
Yeah.
And I think the other point I would make is that too often when I read notes, and this was true actually in the Morgan case, professionals simply write things like they're drinking 3 or 4 cans, or they're drinking a bit, and that kind of information is completely useless.
Yeah.
We 3 or 4 cans could be anything from relatively sensible drinking to dependent drinking.
Yeah.
So people need to be as specific as possible, and that could involve looking around the house if they get in the house and having a look. How many bottles do they see? Things like that.
Absolutely. Folks, she's got increasing arthritic flare-ups caused by rheumatoid arthritis, and she's on methotrexate. What impact would that have on capacity? Anybody like to come in? There's lots of people typing in the chat, but the problem with the chat is it becomes quite hard to monitor. So if you'd like to turn your microphone on.
Can I just come in on one point?
Yeah.
I was just going to mention, I can't remember who it was because there's quite a lot of comments in the chat, but one person actually talked about embarrassment, linking it to another person's comment. And I think when you think here of a lady who's had a professional occupation where she's had status in society, and then suddenly she finds herself in chronic pain with arthritis, potentially struggling with her stoma, a colostomy bag, etc. I think that point re-embarrassment can be a really valid point, and without building that rapport with her, that may not be something we become aware of, how the impact on her emotional as well as her physical well-being.
Teresa, if you don't mind putting your microphone on, I think the point you're making about what could be behind her decision making is important. Teresa, if you've got a microphone, do come in because we'd love to hear from you.
Hi, sorry, yeah, I was just coughing.
Don't worry.
Yeah, just thinking about, the embarrassment and also that fear of social workers or health professionals kind of taking over because she's not coping, she's drinking, and it can sort of roller coaster and people feel they've lost control. So often they just don't want us to get involved for fear we'll be like a bull in a china shop.
Absolutely. Teresa, we know that she's told the carers, don't talk to my granddaughter about my care. When you get a kind of blockage in the natural information sharing that would keep everybody on the same page, how do we get around that? So Christine won't know what the carers know because they feel duty bound to follow what their client has told them. But in terms of information sharing at this point, the GP knows stuff. What about the contact between carers and the GP? so I'll throw that. I won't put Teresa on the spot. I'll throw it out broadly. How would we keep the information sharing loop going so that everybody has a shared understanding of the risks that might be building? And I think that's probably one of the problems. And often in reviews, that's the bit that doesn't happen. The carers know one thing, the GP knows something else. Family members have a perception that's different to anybody else. How do we get that information flow going? And I'll ask any of the social workers on the call, or Deb, to help us out here. How do we get that information shared appropriately to understand Edith's needs?
I think it is a real role for social workers to coordinate that, you know, whether it's through meetings or, you know, bar meetings or MDTs, etc.
Yeah,
It's a real coordinating role. And I think that that issue about sharing information, you know, I think there was mention of sort of sharing information with the daughter, which maybe we don't want to breach confidentiality, but we can share it with the GP and we can share it with the professionals involved.
yeah. And Mike said MDTs are not a magic bullet. They're not always going to solve things. But I think Mike and I would be on the same page when we say quite often in reviews, as things get worse, we bemoan the fact that because there was no formal safeguarding, for example, we hadn't identified together what Edith would consent to, what Edith would engage with, what help she wanted to. Look, we've raised the spectre she may be self-neglecting. And where self-neglect is evident, it's about understanding the little things that Edith would agree to and not trying to force an agenda on her, which we think is in her best interest, because compassionate persistence is the key to self-neglect. By definition, often people who self-neglect are either too embarrassed or too depressed or anxious to motivate themselves, and they will often be resistant to support. But it's compassionate persistence. What does Edith actually want help with? What would she agree with? Gillian, do you want to come in about suicidal ideation? Because we've not really even talked about that. She has gone to hospital having taken, well, she says it was an overdose of painkillers taken by accident, but that was linked up to significant amounts of alcohol.
Hi, yeah, it was just a it's that conversation, is it, around suicide ideation. It's extremely common for people to feel suicidal when they don't know how to live with the pain they're experiencing, whether that's physically
Yeah.
or mentally. And
Yeah,
it's that conversation around wanting to end it all and having a plan to do that are sometimes very different. So expressing out loud, you know, I don't know how to go on, or I really want to be with Wilf, is something very different to having that plan in place. And it's okay to ask about a plan. It's okay to ask about what somebody's plan is to put that in motion.
absolutely.
I was having the conversation earlier. It's not the thing that's going to tip somebody over the edge to complete suicide. Actually opening that conversation and being able to talk about those kinds of things is really important, and having that open space and being the professional who does open that conversation is really important.
So yeah, absolutely. And we're talking, Susan's mentioned IAPT. If Edith engages with IAPT talking therapies and they believe the risk is very high, they can go to the single point of referral at the Black Country Healthcare Trust, and they will organise an assessment by a mental health team. But we might be some distance from that, and we don't know whether Edith is going to engage with IAPT, which would be the first thing to do if she was suffering from mild to moderate depression. But the point that we've just heard is really, really important, because when somebody actually carries out their plan, so if she's taken an overdose with alcohol, she's actually attempted self-harm, we should always try and identify that. But the point is really well made. A lot of people say, I'm fed up with life, I've had enough, I wish I were dead. And without minimizing that, do they actually visualize the mechanism they would use to kill themselves, because when they're telling family and friends about how they're going to do it, mental health teams would recognize that as a far higher level of risk. So look, this isn't great. And the point I was making about rheumatoid arthritis, and particularly methotrexate, is they will have impacts on capacity. So her capacity to make specific decisions could be seriously affected by methotrexate, by arthritis. And we need to bear in mind that by talking to the GP about what impact the treatments will have, or the lack of them, on her ability to make decisions. The carers, of course, are dealing frontline 2 times a day with Edith. I carried out a SAR ADENA, which looked at people at self-harm and suicide attempts, and it's only just been published, but it is, I believe, published now, ADENA, and many of the features of this review and this case study are in ADENA. One of the things I find the most frustrating is how many times the carers who were seeing ADENA on a daily basis were kept out of the loop. For example, they weren't told when she had gone to hospital after self-harm episodes and went home, discharged to home. So the very people who should have known she was self-harming were not even told. Carers struggle to be involved in MDTs and meetings because carers don't get paid, and their care providers won't fund their attendance at MDTs or adult safeguarding meetings. So you may only hear from their managers. You will rarely, if ever, hear from carers. But this is what they could tell us. To be honest, Edith has been a challenging client to engage with. We had to formally warn her about racist abuse of one of the team. Her granddaughter does her shopping and is so patient with her, tries to persuade her to look after herself, but then she orders vodka online and gets it delivered. She could be very aggressive and rude to staff if she's drunk, swearing at them, telling them to leave. So last week she threw a mug at one of the team, saying, "The pain's killing me, you stupid girl. I wish I could die so it would stop." She doesn't eat if we don't supervise her, but several times in the last month, she's demanded the team leave before we could check her medication, wash her, or clean the house. So have a moment or two to think about the implications of that particular new piece of information from the care team for Edith. Yeah, so, Zoe, that's a really good question. So it's Edith who's going online and ordering this stuff. Not Christine, because Christine is really, really determined that she should be preventing her nan drinking. And this is a point I'm sure Mike will talk about. The well-meaning efforts of families sometimes can be counterproductive. But we'll talk about that in a moment. Okay, there's stuff in the chat, but would anybody like to raise their hands? This is an issue that carers often confront where there's self-neglect. But Mike, did you? Yeah, jump in, Mike.
Yeah, I mean, there's lots you could say about the alcohol one. I think most of the points are fairly obvious. One of the ones that I think people need to bear in mind is that there is help for family members of drinkers. So both locally, the local substance misuse service would offer that help, and nationally, there is an organisation called ADFAM, and I'll put this in the chat function for you. They have an online platform called ADFAM at Home, which offers online counselling and online peer support groups, which I think family members often appreciate because it is quite, safe and confidential. So getting help through that, or through the AA equivalent for family members, which is Al-Anon, is worth thinking about.
Absolutely. And Zoe is right that the carers now need to be raising a safeguarding concern, because it's really important that we understand now that there's potential for self-neglect. If she's not feeding herself and she's not taking medication, her experience of pain is increasing, but very importantly, the risk of self-harm is increasing as well. And I was very struck by the fact that if you looked at the granddaughter's attempts to support her nan, she might well engage in the persuading, confronting and nagging that Mike said was so often not going to persuade her nan to confront the alcohol. We've got something here that is the oldest conundrum in the book. It's the dual diagnosis where there's comorbidity of alcohol misuse and depression, anxiety, and possible mental ill health. What are the problems and challenges that you as frontline practitioners face when the GP is having to manage possible alcohol misuse or a growing awareness of alcohol misuse, but also a history of mental ill health? Lots of hands came up there.
It's Teresa.
And Andrea, but Teresa first.
Hi, my hand was really about the previous issue in terms of the carers. It sounds like there's been an ongoing issue where the care hasn't been working terribly well. And I think that's an issue where they should have come back to the social work team straight away to say, we're not able to provide the care you're asking us to do because she's refusing us, she's getting aggressive, etc. That could have been flagged up earlier on to maybe start to unpick what's going on and get involved a bit sooner.
Absolutely. And Andrea?
Hello there. I think the problem is she's taking any medication for her mental health. And I'm not sure if we've asked you if she's taking medication specifically for her mental health. And she's taking the alcohol as well. The medication is probably not doing anything. And often there's a feeling amongst, I think, maybe GPs, but definitely psychiatry, that if a person has mental health issues of a particular type, like let's say low mood and anxiety, and they are drinking, the drinking needs to be sorted first. And so I think based on what you've said, are we going to be able to convince Edith that she needs to talk to somebody who's a new professional, i.e. the drug and alcohol people, to see if we can sort out what's going on with her alcohol use, and then maybe be able to sort out some other things that we can do that might help her mental health? And I also wonder if she's still grieving for her husband, so that might be a different way that her mental health is being affected.
And it's the way in is that conversation where you understand what's important to her. I agree completely, but which approach she would agree to, if any. The trouble with the dual diagnosis is you refer somebody to mental health teams or IAPT but community mental health assessments, and are told we can't assess Edith's mental health if she doesn't manage a period of sobriety. Then when she goes to alcohol services, they'll say the root cause, she's drinking, she's self-medicating, she's drinking to cope with her pain and with her mental ill health. And it becomes this chicken and egg system. The long-term health plan, the NHS England health plan, says there should be no wrong door. And there were services within Sandwell that had those two provisions together, which was lost when Cranston was commissioned for alcohol support. I believe, and Deb might be able to help me or anybody else, that there is now work with Cranston and Healthy Minds to provide exactly the kind of support that Edith might need if she agreed. Mike, have you got your hand up?
Yes. No, it's a new hand. It's a new hand.
Oh, Mike, hang on. Have I just?
This is a new hand.
Yeah.
I can't comment on the Cranston developments, but I can comment on two things. One is, I think with this lady, the starting point would be what we call alcohol identification and brief advice, which is often abbreviated to alcohol IBA. That is using an alcohol screening tool, which is the audit tool. And you'll find that online, an alcohol, if you just Google alcohol audit, you'll find it. It would be recommended you screen her using that tool and then give her some simple brief advice about her drinking. At some levels, that can be very effective. If the issue is really dual diagnosis, then people need to be aware that there are 3 national guidance documents on co-occurring disorders, 1 from NHS England, 2 from NICE. And they do challenge that notion that you've got to sort out one problem first and then you sort out the other. So they're worth reading on that basis. And I will put the links to them into the chat as you're working, Simon.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah, and those are very important to understand because that should be behind the commissioning decisions. And it's ironic, really, that when it comes to the crunch, the commissioning decisions are felt on the ground by citizens, people like Edith, who can't perhaps get the support they need. Deb, you wanted to come in. Deb? Oh, Deb.
Sorry, I've really struggled to, my system crashed and now it's all going wrong, so I really struggled to get my self off mute there. And I just wanted to add that there is a worker that has provides advice and guidance to social workers in relation to drug and alcohol use, and we have some local audit and screening tools that have been developed. So there may be information we can send out in relation to some of that, or as part of the package of resources after this event. And I also saw in the chat that someone had questioned what Safeguarding Adults Board are doing about carers not attending valuable meetings. And I think that the point that's being made is carers, first of all, may not be being invited. Second of all, there's the issue about financial resource and who funds that. So that is on the agenda in terms of assurance, maybe a commissioning conversation, and there are projects that the board is sponsoring in relation to the role of carers, particularly older carers within the borough at the moment. So there is work that is happening in relation to some of these issues that are being raised and challenged, because obviously they link to recommendations from Safeguarding Adult Reviews.
I particularly thank you, Debs. That's really helpful, and I particularly like Gillian Garrett's last post at 1433, and the end bit there is so significant, isn't it? I'll come to Kelly in a moment. Carers are the eyes and ears going in every day. They can observe deterioration. They can see that there's increased recycling, hidden bottles, and so they're seeing the changes on a day-to-day, on a twice daily basis. It's very difficult when they're dealing with somebody who's aggressive, who's physically violent. They take, they run a risk of being hurt. They have to be patient. They have to be calm. They have to challenge inappropriate behaviour or racist behaviour. They should talk to the manager, and the manager should talk with Edith. But why is Edith reacting the way she is? Is it the combination of depression, anxiety, alcohol, frustration with pain? Adina's case was so significant because she was constantly looked at as having a mental health problem, but she was telling people clearly, it's the pain. I cannot cope with the pain, and I want to die if it will stop. If they could have worked effectively with the pain management, they would have perhaps helped with the mental ill health. I will try and find the link. NICE did a new guidance on pain management that was highly controversial. I think it was 2 years ago or 18 months ago, and it challenged whether traditional medication was the right route for pain management, but acknowledged it's probably one of the hardest things to deal with because pain comes from so many sources, and knowing how to mitigate its impact is still one of the great challenges of medicine. So the NICE guidance on pain management was about 18 months ago, or 2 years. Look, I think we probably all agree there's growing evidence that, for example, when she says, don't come in the house, I don't want help with feeding, with eating, I don't want my meals supervised, I don't want you checking whether I've got medication, she's making decisions about her care, which she's entitled to make, but we need to think about capacity. So I'm going to revisit capacity just briefly to hit on a couple of key points that often come up in reviews. So if you know your MCA backwards, please bear with me now. For those of you who are less confident with it, let's remember, talking about capacity should be decisional time specific. So generally, we're talking about Edith's ability to make specific decisions. And there are 5 key principles. The starting one is that there is a presumption of capacity, which from Edith's point of view means you should start by thinking I can make a decision. Okay? What does that mean, though, when there's growing evidence of self-neglect? And Mike touched on this point as well. You cannot use the presumption of capacity as an excuse for not assessing capacity in relation to self-neglect. And the Court of Protection have said in stated cases that where there is legitimate doubt as to an adult's capacity or reasonable cause for concern, you should be considering assessment of capacity. And Alex Rock-Keane, King's Counsel, Alex Rock-Keane, will put his link in 39 Essex Chambers in the chat. Alex Rock-Keane is probably the go-to man when it comes to capacity and issues around assessment of capacity. And he says that the biggest problem with self-neglect is the failure to assess capacity. Now, can I just make a point? There's somebody's hand. Mike, you wanted to come in.
No, that's an old hand, sorry.
Oh, sorry.
It's
Okay.
my
Yeah. So Alex Rock-Keane says, where you have reasonable cause for concern or legitimate doubt, the Court of Protection have said it, assess capacity in relation to identified needs. You cannot assess Edith's capacity by phoning her and having a chat about whether she wants help. You will find out whether she is willing to accept help, but you won't have any idea of her ability to make decisions about feeding herself, taking her medication, engaging with healthcare support like alcohol services, like IAPT. But one thing you sometimes notice in capacity is a lack of understanding when you do assess capacity of the balance or burden of proof. If you are going to say Edith lacks capacity, you need to provide evidence, and your level of proof is that it is more likely than not that she does or doesn't have capacity. And that is the civil burden of proof. And the civil burden of proof, folks, is sometimes crudely called the 51% rule, because 51% is more likely than not, by 51 to 49. You will get people, sometimes quite eminent consultants, who will say things like, this is a very important decision, deciding whether we should do this treatment, or, for example, deciding whether Edith can choose where she should live for the rest of her days, is a very important decision, and I would want to be pretty certain that she lacked capacity if I was going to make that decision. Being pretty certain is a luxury. It's lovely if you are pretty certain or absolutely certain, because you have far out surpassed the burden of proof. 51% or more, whether you're deciding whether Edith has capacity to decide what to wear on a wet day when she goes out, or life-changing decisions. The burden of proof doesn't change. So you do need to challenge people who tell you you have to be certain or be very certain. I understand why they feel like that. And that's why we talk about erring on the side of capacity when it's very close. But if we err on the side of capacity, but actually think I was pretty certain that I was more certain than not that she lacked capacity, then you might not be doing her a service when you reluctantly say she has capacity when in fact she doesn't. She might make very bad choices without capacity. But individuals have to be supported to make their own decisions. It's very important that in capacity assessments you record what you did to maximise Edith's ability to make choices for herself. And as Mike pointed out before, an unwise choice, you must not say I lack capacity because my decision seems unwise. And if you are reasonably satisfied, 51% or more, then your best interest assessment, you should use a checklist of what would be in the best interest. But remember, you're trying to establish what she would choose if she had capacity, not what you think's best for her, but what she would have chosen if we could have had this conversation when she still had capacity, which is always the best thing to do. And then, of course, we're looking for the least restrictive option. Okay, any questions about that? About that presumption of capacity particularly?
Can I just ask, it's Geeta here, sorry.
Yeah.
In regards to a capacity assessment, is it like a single agency? Is it one person who would do that, or is it multi-agency?
Geeta, anybody can assess capacity. After all, a carer working with an adult has to make capacity assessments all the time. Almost every decision that she would be asked to make, you're doing a rapid capacity. So it goes from extremely complex to very simple. You would be very unwise in complex cases not to get all the advice you can on an Edith's medical condition, the impact of alcohol on function, the impact of rheumatoid arthritis on capacity. Sufferers of rheumatoid arthritis have something called brain fog. They call it brain fog at the RA Association. It's where you get confused about dates, you forget names because of the level of pain and sometimes because of drugs like methotrexate. So yeah, Geeta, the more complex the choice, the more you should get advice. But for example, if you're the decision maker, the social worker, the surgeon, you cannot delegate capacity assessments to experts. You get their advice and then you decide whether you are reasonably satisfied that adult has capacity for the decision you're asking them to make. So it doesn't require expertise, but you should use experts when you are unclear about the impact of any element of that adult's presentation on capacity. Anybody like to add anything at this point or ask anything else? Thank you, Geeta. Yeah, Teresa.
Hi, yeah, just in terms of that presumption of capacity, one of the ways that I was taught about it and I've passed on to people is just to emphasize that that presumption puts the responsibility on us to prove that someone lacks capacity rather than they have to prove they have capacity. And I think when I think of it in that way, it helps me to avoid that getting stuck in that sort of cycle of, well, I've got to presume capacity even when it's clear that there's a lot of reasons to doubt capacity. And I think sometimes then people get sort of caught up in, well, I've got to presume capacity even though there's lots of evidence cropping up that should make you have reason to doubt and do the assessment.
Yeah, and that phrase that I've just underlined, Teresa, I would always include in my write-up. For the following reasons, I have legitimate doubt as to Edith's capacity. And you would explain some of the things that have happened. But remember, we're not trying to decide whether she had capacity full stop, because every time an adult with capacity would be asked to make choices in their life, we should be thinking, what can we do to maximize Edith's ability to make this choice for herself? Because she will have capacity and it will fluctuate. There is nothing harder than assessing capacity in relation to somebody with a significant alcohol problem. I think it was I don't want to put Mike on the spot, but the Alcohol Society, I think it's the Alcohol Society, who did a paper a few years ago on assessing capacity with people with significant alcohol misuse problems. And they recognised some of the challenges that were related to that.
Yeah, it was Alcohol Change UK published a document on safeguarding vulnerable dependent drinkers, which includes a big section on assessing capacity with this client group. And that was written by myself and Professor Michael Preston Shute. And I imagine you would have come on to this, Simon, but it does raise particularly the question of executive capacity.
Yeah. And we're going to talk about that in a moment, Mike. Yeah. And that's when I will really help that your perspective will jump in, because help me out with that. So look, the Mental Capacity Act puts front and foremost the practical steps. And if you have the misfortune of ending up in the court of protection because a family have challenged a capacity assessment or a best interest assessment, or even a DNA CPR, and you have concluded that a patient was unable to make that choice, you were reasonably satisfied they lacked capacity, the first thing the judge will ask is describe the practical steps, and they will want to see them documented. So it may not be relevant in Edith's case, the communication methods, but the best time of day, very definitely with somebody with an alcohol problem, you need to consider, when are we going to catch them in a position where they're best able to talk about the issue, and maybe allowing them to have had a drink to calm them, but not too many. I mean, you seriously would need to plan this, because if you come at the wrong time of day, your adult may be suffering lack of capacity because of alcohol. The best location. The more that Edith self-neglects, the more obvious is the fact that the best place to assess her self-care and the care of the home and the struggles she's having is where she's relaxed in her home. Is there anybody who can help us? Is it possible that her granddaughter will facilitate a capacity assessment by reassuring her and relaxing her? Or do we need an advocate under the Care Act? But crucially, if you're going to talk with Edith about a choice she has to make, you need to have identified exactly what you think the key information is for that choice. Identify how you made sure that you were reasonably satisfied Edith understood that key information. And last, there's a catch-all. Anything else you could do to help that adult understand the choice. The most striking example Alex Rook-Keane has mentioned recently was the lengths that a social care team went to educate an adult with learning disability about sexual health, because there were such anxieties that he wanted to be sexually active. And in fact, probably the biggest area of debate in the Court of Protection is around an adult's right to self-determination in relation to sexual activity when, for example, they have learning disability. So Alex Rook-Keane and 39 Essex Chambers, we'll put the link in later so that you can find that. So mental capacity. One little banana skin to remember is sometimes some guidance tells you to identify the impairment of the mind or brain and then to see whether the patient has capacity. The law is clear on this. It does not say it that way round. Judges have said, do not consider the impairment first. After all, if you are reasonably satisfied Edith has capacity, you won't need to look for an impairment. And the reason I'm stressing this is if you know somebody has psychosis or severe mental ill health or dementia, the problem is that you may, without realizing it, give up on their ability to make the choice too soon. So you can't forget what you know, but don't record that as your entry point. Record what you need them to understand to make the choice, and then go through the function test. If we need it, we'll go to the second stage, but not first, second. Can they understand the key information? Remember, don't set the bar too high. After all, if you expect them to know really complex medical conditions, a lot of adults would fail your capacity test. It's the key salient points. If Edith is struggling with her memory, if somebody has dementia, they only have to be able to keep that in their mind long enough to make the choice. The fact that a week later they can no longer make a capacitous choice, they can't revisit it, doesn't alter the fact it was correctly done when you did it, because they retain that information long enough to use or weigh it. Not the way you think they should, that's not relevant. They can make very perverse, very strange, potentially unwise choices, but that's why you need to understand Edith's lived experience. Her experiences with Wilf might temper the way she thinks about hospital treatment, the way she thinks about professional support. And you need to understand that, because using or weighing it is simply the way that the adult reaches a decision, and there has to be some followable thread, but it doesn't have to be the same thread as yours. We'll talk about people's choices and executive functioning next, because it becomes really relevant. A lot of capacity assessments would happen in a surgery or in their house, where they're asked to make a choice and you are reasonably satisfied after 30 or 40 minutes that they've made a choice, they could use or weigh it, and the material time is the 30, 40 minutes it took to make that capacity assessment. However, as Mike pointed out, where executive function's impacted, we need to know, can they talk the talk and walk the walk? And the material time for that capacity assessment might need to extend over a period to see whether they can put into action, use or weigh what they want to do and put it into action. And of course, finally communicate it. Only if you are reasonably satisfied somebody lacks capacity do you move on to the next stage. Why? And then you can use your pre-existing knowledge of their mental health, their physical, their mental impairments. What is the impairment or disturbance in Edith's mind or brain? Is it alcohol, which could be temporary? So we should perhaps put off the capacity assessment if she's going to recover long enough to regain capacity. It could be sepsis. It could be an acquired brain injury, concussion. It can be confusion caused by medical treatment. UTIs cause a lack of capacity. So what's the impairment? The banana skin in this element is that it has to be the only reason they can't make the choice. Nothing else is relevant. It would help if it said, and is this the only reason? Let me give a quick example that Alex Rock-Keane uses. You're supporting an adult with learning disability, and he's being asked to make a choice between some treatments. But as you're carrying out the capacity assessment, you become more and more aware he appears to be trying to decide what his carers would choose rather than what he wants. That's impacting on his ability to make the choice, but it has nothing to do with an impairment or disturbance of the mind or brain. You would need to get the carers in. You would need to satisfy yourself that they have encouraged the adult to make the choice they want and ignore what they think the carers want. And if you were satisfied that element had been removed, then you could judge whether you were reasonably satisfied Edith had made the choice for herself. Any questions on any of that? Okay, so executive functioning is something that specialists will advise practitioners on. The executive functioning of Edith may need to be assessed, but this is why it's so important. Edith may not have this situation, but people with acquired brain injury, people with alcohol-related brain damage, significant things like Korsakoff's, people who have suffered brain injury, and have got the current consensus is lesions on the frontal cortex of the brain. At the frontal cortex of the brain, all of this good stuff happens. Edith's insight, her planning, her attention to detail, her ability to generate ideas, control behaviors and emotions. So if her capacity is in doubt, it could be that her flare-ups, her aggression, is not linked to alcohol or linked to mental ill health, but linked to physical damage within the brain. And importantly, problem solving and judgment and decision making. And this is called sometimes the frontal lobe paradox, which many of you will have heard about, but we can't overstress this. And that's why the capacity assessment of somebody with frontal lobe damage might be stretched over a longer period. And we'd use what are called articulate and demonstrate models, because Edith's decision making could be masked by what is apparently very articulate use of language. She's very confident that she can do what she says she's going to do. But sadly, her decision making could be good in theory, but actually very poor in practice. So remember, we'd have to give her all the support to make the choices for herself. But importantly, we'd have to identify the gaps in her self-care and protection. What are her real world behaviors? And you are not going to do this in a 20-minute conversation about, for example, her willingness to actually eat regularly, which apparently the carers have said she's refusing to do. Is she aware of her deficits? Can she respond to the deficits and come up with a plan? And she's unlikely to be able to rely on a single assessment. So we're going to look for mismatches. What do the carers say? So imagine we engage with Edith and we're trying to decide whether she has capacity to manage her nutrition, which after all is one of the crucial outcomes of care and support. And Edith says to you, look, I do want to eat. Obviously I do. But I know I haven't been, and I should listen to the carers because they do tell me to eat. So Edith, what do you think stops you eating? Why aren't you eating? And she says, well, I think it's because I've got a memory problem. I forget to eat. I don't remind myself to eat. So she shows an understanding of her deficit. Does Edith understand the impact it's having on her ability to manage her nutrition? So when the carers aren't there, will she remember to eat? And she says, well, I've got a memory problem, which means I struggle to take in and remember information or to do the things in my day-to-day routine. Okay, so Edith, you've told me you want to eat and you want to make sure you keep yourself healthy eating. Remember, self-neglect, those little victories are so important. Yeah, says Edith, of course I want to eat. So you've got a memory problem, which means you might forget. So how are you going to get around that? This is anticipatory awareness. This is where Edith shows she's got a plan. I've got a memory problem and I struggle to take in information in my day-to-day routine. So I'm going to use notes on my fridge to remind me to eat and check the dates of food before I eat them, because apparently poor Edith has made herself ill eating food past its sell-by date, we discover. It would be tempting to say she has demonstrated capacity, and I am reasonably satisfied she has capacity. But if she can talk the talk and not walk the walk, we need to see whether there are mismatches between what she says she's going to do and what she does. If after a week the carers say, or 2 weeks, the carers say, good news, Edith's definitely eating, we've not had to remind her, she's cooperating, you'd be reasonably satisfied she had capacity to manage her nutrition. But if they say, oh, it's hopeless, the last 2 times we came in, she hadn't eaten anything, and we pointed to the notes on the fridge and said, Edith, what about the notes to remind you? And she said, I don't know what they mean. And I don't know what they mean about checking dates because I haven't got any appointments with the doctor, so I don't know what that means. I think you'd be reasonably satisfied that she may lack capacity at the moment to manage nutrition. She can talk the talk and walk the walk, and in people, but not walk the walk. And in people with executive functioning problems, which may not be the case for Edith, but it's very important to understand, articulate and demonstrate models are the only way, as frontline practitioners, you're going to get the basic information that would then lead to a more in-depth assessment. Mike, did you want to come in there, or have...
Well, I think you've done a tremendous job there, Simon. I would emphasise that this is really important with people with alcohol problems, because there is a very high rate of cognitive impairment in dependent drinkers, not just alcohol-related brain damage, but because of, the risk of falls, the risk of fights, the risk of fits, even the risk of domestic abuse. Then there's a very high risk that people are going to have this frontal lobe damage. Some evidence suggests as many as 50% of people in substance misuse services have got a traumatic brain injury in their background. And what's also worth saying is those brain injuries come quicker and quicker. Once you've had one alcohol-related brain injury, you are 4 times more likely to have another. And so people are getting more and more damage more and more quickly. So it's really important to do what you're saying. Don't just tell me, show me, is what you're saying here. And that is vital with this client group.
Anybody else got any questions or any observations about how they've assessed capacity in situations like this? Look, it would be tempting to... It's so tempting to say, because of her situation, Edith hasn't got capacity, but it has to be clear, and you need to with self-neglect. If she is self-neglecting, what are we looking to demonstrate? If it's going to go to safeguarding because of our concerns for her self-neglect, what do we need to demonstrate is the situation? Well, we have to identify whether she has care and support needs, and self-neglect is pretty evidently going to suggest, yes, she has, and we know she's had them assessed before. It could be that her care and support needs have increased. Is she at risk of abuse or neglect? Well, self-neglect is abuse or neglect. Is she unable to protect herself from the risk from self-neglect? And to demonstrate that we should be going to safeguarding, the carers, the GP, and anybody else involved would have to show that if she has capacity, that she's refusing to engage with a support plan and is now at serious risk of harm to her health or well-being. So if Edith has capacity, we will go towards safeguarding, because if she's at risk of serious harm, that's when social care will take responsibility now, working with colleagues to come up with a care plan that Edith may engage with. Of course, if she lacks capacity in relation to any of her identified needs, self-care, engagement with her health plan, engagement with her healthcare in relation to rheumatoid arthritis, for example, the pain management team, engagement with IAPT if that's felt to be appropriate. If there's any doubts about that, we'd be acting in her best interest to support her. But look, is Edith going to cooperate simply because we've decided she lacks capacity? Of course not. We're still going to have to try and engage to understand what she will agree to, what she does want help with. And there's a complex range of issues there. Her worries about finances, her engagement with her family, the poor relationship with her son, her distrust of the one person in the family who's trying to support her. All of this needs to be identified to understand pies, the complex picture that will help us identify what Edith will engage with. Debs, did you want to come in or add anything, or anybody else at this point?
I think I just wanted to emphasise that don't just say it, do it, or don't just tell me, show me. I think that's really, really key. And then, as we've all said, as you said, much more articulately than I, frankly, but then also that becomes, if we don't see that, and we see the difference between what is said and what is shown, then that's evidence to, you know, reasonably suspect that that individual lacks capacity. So it's about what we also do with what we're not seeing.
The trouble is, if Edith doesn't engage and the carers we're relying on the carers to identify the risk, she can become hidden in plain sight. She deteriorates and days go to weeks and months where people are saying, we barely seen her. She's not engaged with the GP. She's not gone here. She's not gone to that treatment. And without carers going in, or Christine, we're likely to miss substantial problems. Because I can't stress enough, Adina's story brought it home to me. And Teresa's point is absolutely true about capacity. Somebody with cognitive impairment, somebody with, say, Alzheimer's or dementia, will have opportunities where she will or he will be able to make choices for themselves. So that's why it's so important to make multiple attempts to assess capacity and document the attempts you've made. Think about different times of the day, different places, what might impact on their ability and their choices. So that's really important as well. Yeah, Teresa, thank you. Anybody else got any observations or questions? Please, if you've got questions at this point, do ask. Okay. There is a development now, and I want to think now from here on in about how we risk assess. And this is at the heart of this whole self-determination for adults is really important. Being allowed to make decisions for yourself is really important. But people who self-harm, people who attempt suicide, generally do not remain suicidal once they're supported with mental ill health, for example. Let's look at what happens next, and I'll give you a moment or two to think what should happen now. This is a crew commander from West Midlands Fire Service. Edith suffers of house fire. We were called by a neighbour who saw smoke coming from an open window. Mrs. Morris, the occupier, was apparently in her sitting room and said a blanket had accidentally fallen against the electric fire and caught a light. So we asked why she hadn't called 999, but she said she didn't want to make a fuss. The fire damage was fortunately not significant, but then the crew identified there was a separate seat of fire in a waste paper basket 3 or 4 meters from the electric fire. So an accidental explanation seems a little implausible. It is really lucky the neighbour spotted this, given Edith's poor mobility. I doubt she could have self-evacuated if the fires had spread. Okay, so West Midlands Fire Service are now involved. They've gone to the scene of what could have been, by the sounds of it, a life-threatening situation. Take a moment or two to think about what you think should happen now in relation to Edith. Okay. So in terms of risk management, we've got a significantly increased risk. Zoe, can you come in on your microphone? Because I do so like to hear people's opinions and views. Zoe.
Hello.
So, go ahead, Zoe, go on.
I'm just wondering, was this intentional by yourself? Considering you mentioned about the waste paper basket being 3 or 4 meters away from the electric fire, it was a separate fire, so it's almost as if there were 2 ignition points starting rather than just the one, which suggests it's less likely to be accidental, like originally claimed.
Yeah.
But then you also mentioned as well about how poor her mobility was, that she definitely wouldn't be able to get out. Was she even capable of lighting that 3 or 4 meters away?
That's a possibility. Yeah.
But
Unfortunately, Zoe, I think I would answer that in the affirmative. If this has been an attempt to set a fire in our house, yeah, she would have been capable of doing that. But what the crew commander is saying is, if the fire had taken hold, would she have had the mobility and nimbleness on her feet to get out if she wanted to? And he doubted it. Okay. So, yeah, what about mental health here?
well, you've had in her history, you've talked about how she's been admitted to hospital with, you know, an accidental overdose of a pain medication and a significant amount of alcohol at the same time. This could potentially be an attempt to suicide. So has that been looked into? You know, is she still suicidal? Because the last time mental health was talked about, she was referred on to talking therapies, wasn't she? Several. I don't know whether that's actually happened in the meantime or not. But yeah, is she? Yeah, I'd want to know: is she suicidal, and does she need support?
Yeah. Look, her mental health and her experience of severe chronic pain are very, very closely linked. Were she not in chronic pain, the question would be, would she still want to self-harm if indeed this is a self-harm attempt? What does the Mental Health Act, what support could we have as professionals from mental health at this point? Would anybody like to help me out here? I'm very conscious we've got Charmaine somewhere. Charmaine, are you there? I'm hoping you're there, Charmaine. Anybody else?
Simon.
Oh, excellent. So you'll put me right if I get this bit wrong. Anybody else, though, from your experience, like to say what you think should happen now? If you were in, let's imagine we're in an MDT. So quite rightly, so there's been a safeguarding referral made by the crew commander. We're social workers, we're professionals discussing this case. What would be the next steps, folks? Anybody like to help us out? What do you think we should be doing? It is tricky now because does she have capacity? Well, what's she got to have capacity for? What are we asking her here if we're assessing her capacity? Teresa. Thank you, Teresa.
I think I would like to chat to her about what she means when she's saying, you know, I didn't want to make a fuss. You know, is she just sort of trying to push us away because it was a deliberate thing that she, you know, either started the fire or was happy to just sit there watching it, or was she confused and didn't know what to do and she's trying to hide that, you know, or is she just really not recognizing that the fire was a real significant risk and she needed to do something about it or call for help, or was she just physically unable? I think all of that's going to factor into risk assessments and capacity assessments going forwards.
Yeah, absolutely. And the risk assessment needs to take into account her capacity, but also her current situation in relation to her mental ill health. Because somebody's raised on the chat the possibility of her being sectioned. It's really important to stress sectioning somebody when they need that immediate care and control because they pose, because of their mental ill health, such a serious risk of harm to themselves or others. After all, setting a fire, if you're in a house, could be that you're putting other people at risk as well. But sectioning somebody has to be the only possible solution. It's not done lightly, and the new Mental Health Act, when and if it comes into play, makes it now even harder, quite rightly, to use sectioning as a response to mental ill health, because if there's another way round, that should be taken. And I can't stress enough how much somebody's will to harm themselves can be. Adina makes it so clear. It wasn't mental ill health. It was the experience of chronic pain that led Adina to conclude the only solution to her chronic pain, because she had failed to engage with support and didn't believe support would help her. The only solution was to end her life. It was, in her mind, a rational decision. And Charmaine, help me out here. How are we going to help Edith? How should our frontline professionals be thinking at this point?
Sorry, Simon. So I've got my hand up, and I'll note that I'm not sure whether Kelly's still here. So I know Kelly's an AMP as well. But in these sort of circumstances, you know, as an AMP, the last thing we want to do is detain someone under the Mental Health Act. So it would be looking at it would be an AMP coordinating a Mental Health Act assessment and looking at what support is needed that could be provided to either, it would have been, you've referred to Adina, or for Edith. And it might be a case of that she's struggling at home, and it might be a period of respite that could be organised. But as always, we would risk assess. And if it was a case of actually she is intent on ending her life, she's made plans, she's executed those plans, then it may be if she refuses hospital admission, she's suffering with poor mental health, then we may possibly detain, or she may agree to come into hospital informally, where detention under the Act wouldn't be required. But one thing that the AMP generally does do is we would be looking at liaising with other services, liaising with that person and family members to find out the correct support that is required for Edith in those circumstances. We wouldn't necessarily just go running in and say, come on then, let's detain you and take you to psychiatric hospital, because we're going to be looking at the most therapeutic response to Edith's needs.
Yeah, absolutely. And let's think about it from the fire services point of view. They've turned up to this house fire, and probably because it's a house fire, there's going to be an ambulance present. They probably will have got an ambulance present. They've got to make a decision before they leave about where this goes. They can't just drive away saying, well, we put the fire out, it didn't spread, it was tiny, because it could have done, it could have been life-threatening. And if the crew commander thinks Mrs. Morris has tried to set fire to the house, that's not good. Is she trying to self-harm? Remember, the crew commander from West Midlands Fire Service doesn't have access to her medical health records that would have told him about previous admissions. The ambulance crew will know if they've been to the house before. So when she was admitted to hospital after an overdose of paracetamol, which she denied was a self-harm attempt, they will know that happened. They may now, with their EPRF, the electronic patient record, be able to share with the crew commander when she went into hospital before, she was assessed because there was concern she'd made a suicidal attempt. They've updated their electronic patient record after several reviews said it wasn't sufficient, and they now have more information about the medical care that resulted from ambulance call-outs before. But what won't be clear is what her medical history will tell us about the risk. So the risk management there and then is going to be really challenging, isn't it? If Edith says to the crew commander, "I'm sorry, mate, I don't know why you're saying I've set fire to the house. You're saying I should," you're talking to social care, you've phoned up their emergency duty team, but I don't want anybody coming out. What would we do then? So imagine the crew commander says, "Look, I've had a chat with the emergency duty team at social care, and they're going to come out and help me and talk to you." And she says, "I don't want anybody coming out and talking to me." Where would we go from there? So just to make life difficult, because Adina did this to frontline personnel on numerous occasions. So numerous times with Adina, they faced this same conundrum: self-harm, chronic pain in the history, and a refusal to accept support. What do we do then? So several people have asked, what's an AMP? So it's an approved mental health practitioner. So within social care are approved mental health practitioners who can initiate mental health support if it's a crisis situation. So if she says, "I don't want anybody coming out," what would we do then? Anybody know what we would do at that point? I don't want to jump straight to Kelly and give Charmaine a break, but anybody else? So it's important to understand that where capacity and mental health meet, there are no easy solutions. If the ambulance crew said, "Well, we don't think that Edith's got capacity here, Fire Chief, so we could get her to hospital for a checkup and a mental health assessment." If Edith agreed to that, and she indeed did lack capacity, perhaps because of alcohol, that would be a possible solution. But if she said, "I'm not going to hospital, I don't care whether you think I've got capacity," that would not give them the power to force her to go to hospital against her wish. We would have to use the provision of the Mental Health Act, because the MCA requires it to be for a vital act or life-sustaining treatment. That's the only time an ambulance could force Edith to go to hospital to be assessed against her will. So, Kelly, would you like to jump in, or anybody else, and help me with what the right path would be? So we've got her to a point where she may well have been self-harming or attempting to self-harm, and the fire chief has told us she could have killed herself here. If that's what she intended to do, it's only because the neighbours saw the flame or the smoke. Anybody like to help me out here? But she's refusing to go to hospital, and the ambulance crew have said she has capacity. She hasn't got capacity, sorry. She hasn't got capacity.
An AMP could apply for a warrant?
Yeah, Charmaine, and this is really important. Zoe, the community crisis team are not really a blue light service. They're not really, well, so as Charmaine says, if we feel she has to be assessed and she won't cooperate and she has chosen not to, even if she lacks capacity, the most sensible path is for the AMP to get a warrant under Section 135, and then they would be supported to get back in the home. If Edith says, "Everybody leave, I don't want you here," they could go back into the home. But that might be the only way to support her if she won't cooperate or won't accept help. So it's a really complex, difficult situation we're in. To sum up then, safeguarding decisions that have to be made. So they do get the safeguarding referral at the team from Midlands Fire. There was a significant risk to Edith, but what isn't clear is how the fire started. Edith's history causes real concern. There's been suspected self-harm episodes, and suicidal ideation is something both the carers and her granddaughter have raised, together with concerns around self-neglect. Christine, Edith's granddaughter, has already asked that her care needs be reassessed, and her complex health needs and her reluctance to engage with her care are not encouraging. We started to discuss the possibility of supported accommodation, but Edith was furious, saying they'd love that, to get their hands on my house. That's what they all want. We're at a very complex point in the decision making here. The risk management of Edith's care, understanding what help she will engage with, but also identifying whether mental ill health has meant now that she's at serious risk of self-harm. If she lacks capacity, then the safeguarding decisions can be made in relation to her best interest, and they can be made together with her to understand what help she will accept and try and identify paths to get her the right level of help. As Charmaine said, we could do a mental health assessment under Section 135. It might be that a period of mental health support would be needed, but I suspect what was needed most was an understanding of the whole picture around her life, her antagonism to the rest of the family based on concerns about finances. At her heart, she was trying to decide what to do with her home, how to finance her life, but she also had the alcohol misuse that was unaddressed. Did she have capacity for the decisions she was being asked to make? We haven't really clearly identified that. What is crucial, though, to understand is that if she has capacity, if she does have capacity and is now at serious risk of harm to her health and well-being, so she's now at serious risk of health problems or serious risk of harm, and she has capacity, but if she did not have care and support needs, so Edith clearly needs to go down the safeguarding route, but if this was an adult who did not have care and support needs, then in Sandwell, there is a process that we briefly mentioned that Debs will probably want to talk a bit about, which is vulnerable adult risk management. And it's something that everybody should be aware of. Oh, Deb, do you want to come in on?
I am coming in. I'm just, my system is slow. Apologies, everybody. I don't know whether it was me or the system, to be honest, but something is slow. I mean, I think the whole issue of what is not care and support needs is a subject for another session, really. But I've put in the chat earlier today, we do have the vulnerable adults risk management pathway in Sandwell, which is another opportunity really for people to come together to discuss risk, including the individual and or family members or key others around that circle of support. So that's another opportunity really to bring people together, because one of my takeaways from today is the necessity really and the importance of working in partnership, both with individuals, families and partners, to really get a clear understanding as to what makes the world tick for an individual and how that helps identify risk and move forward with a risk plan.
Yeah, absolutely. And the self-neglect policy document for the West Midlands makes it very clear that we can't use the old excuse that somebody's chosen to self-neglect and they have capacity. Dismissing self-neglect as a lifestyle choice is not an appropriate.
It's not acceptable.
Is not an appropriate path in a compassionate or caring society. So the West Midlands policy makes it very clear. Where somebody is self-neglecting, it's usually a symptom of other problems, such as mental ill health, depression, anxiety, isolation, social isolation, or economic resource. That could well be an unexplored area in Edith's case. Is she struggling financially? And is that the reason she wanted to release capital? Is she isolated from family support because of her relationship with her son, so that she's distrustful of Christine, who's doing her best to try and support her? Trauma. And people right at the start of the session said 4 years ago, Edith lost Wilf in circumstances that caused her to be bitter, angry, feel that she had been let down by her former employers, by society at large, because she lost her pension and Wilf's pension. So economic resource can be a factor. Neuropsychological problems can be a factor. And Mike's made it really, really clear. If she has a developing alcohol problem, then that could be behind her self-neglect. So self-neglect is rarely, if ever, a lifestyle choice. Behind it are things that have caused Edith to lose the will. And Adina's story and Edith's has one thing in common. Do not underestimate the impact that chronic pain has on adults' mental health, suicidal ideation, or even suicidal attempts, because chronic pain management is behind so many safeguarding adult reviews. Has anybody got any questions about anything we've said? Somebody's just raised a VARM. Does it require the patient's consent? Zoe, as I understand it, because you're talking about somebody at risk of serious harm or death, the sharing of information by professionals does not require the adult's consent, but the process very much is aimed at encouraging the adult to be part of the risk management process. So there is a letter in the pro forma that is sent out to the adults that explain that point. And getting their agreement and engagement is really crucial. If you initiate VARM as a professional, so you believe an adult's at risk of serious harm, and it could be because of self-neglect or hoarding, or they could be victims of racial hatred, community type crimes, and they're not engaging with care. If you ask that a VARM meeting takes place, you identify agencies that could help with the risk management, and they should be coming to the meeting armed with their understanding of risk. So VARM would allow the fire service to share concerns, the police, housing, carers, so that we work with that adult to see what they will agree to, what they would engage with to mitigate and reduce risk. If you invite an agency to VARM, they should attend, and if the professional who was due to attend can't, they should send somebody in their place who's sufficiently briefed to provide that risk management discussion. Documentation of VARM and the documents around it are on the Adult Way at Sandwell Adult Safeguarding Board website, as is a podcast that explains what vulnerable adult risk management is all about. So there is plenty of scope to follow it up if you look at the Sandwell Safeguarding Adult Board's website. Debs, I don't know if you want to add anything there. I think that's...
No, I more briefly than you just answered Zoe's question, and also Teresa really helpfully put the link in the chat so that people can access that.
Thank you, Teresa. Okay, folks. I think probably we've reached a natural conclusion here. And I don't know if it's a plus, but you are going to be escaping this session 45 to 50 minutes earlier, possibly, than we were due to. 20 to 4. So I will hang on, as will Debs, if you want to ask any questions or make any points. But I hope you've found it that it's put some of the safeguarding reviews into context, and you've got from Mike and hopefully from myself some pointers about better practice or ways to get support. I'll hang on with Debs if there's anything anybody wants to raise. Otherwise, I'll say thanks very much, and I hope that it's been useful. I don't know, Debs, is there a feedback form that you've planned, or have we not got one?
I haven't got one, but I welcome email returns from people or any feedback in the chat now. We've also got a question, what happened to Edith next? Please answer the question.
If the support is coordinated and if the pain management issue could be addressed in a way where Edith was persuaded this will really help how you feel. In Adina's case, she'd lost faith in health professionals being able to provide pain relief. She no longer believed that pain relief, other than death, was the only way she could see. And I'll never forget the crew commander who turned up to the fires saying, before I even got to the house, I could hear Adina moaning in pain in the house. She wasn't putting on a show. She wasn't hamming it up for professionals. She was in such constant pain that she was crying in pain before the crew commander even arrived. And Adina's case is dramatically more tragic than Edith, because Edith, with the right support, will survive. Adina's case, ADEENA, is a Sandwell SAR. And Adina tragically took her own life by setting fire in her home after there had been 3 separate similar episodes, and professionals felt unable to come up with a plan, which is partly why vulnerable adult risk management was pushed through in Sandwell, because in Adina's case, agencies froze at the point when she was at the highest level of risk. And a lot of wonderful, hardworking professionals would have felt personally to have failed Adina when, after several episodes of self-harm and fire and threats of self-harm, she succeeded and was burnt to death in her home. And Adina's case is an absolute tragedy because we've not assessed or understood pies. Just like Edith, the risk is if you don't understand the background, if you don't understand why she's feeling so desperate and identify what she would engage with, she would swear at professionals, she would be resentful and angry. Edith's case doesn't have to end like Adina's. And that's the point I'd make. Self-neglect and tragic outcomes from self-neglect are tragically not rare. They're probably one of the most frequent subjects, as Mike would point out. Self-neglect linked to alcohol misuse, mental ill health, are the most frequent subject of SARS all around the country. So, yeah. Look, folks, I'm sorry to leave you on such a down note, but as I say, if we get coordinated response in Edith's case and understand the help and support she will accept. People who self-neglect rarely go backwards when we've made small steps forwards. But if you never understand what she will agree to, if she never understands what support she wants, like financial support and advice, like building a relationship with her son, like understanding pain management, getting her to pain management, getting her to IAPT, helping her with alcohol. And alcohol services now more and more don't try and encourage Edith to stop, give up. They'll help her reduce alcohol. So Cranston and people like that will work on alcohol reduction, not complete cessation, for example. So look, folks, thank you very much. As I say, I hope this slightly different approach to learning from reviews has given you food for thought. Do give feedback to Debs, because heaven forbid she might try and plan another of these another year, and she probably wants to hear what you think. I'm so sorry if you wanted to be virtual. I mean, you wanted to be face to face and it didn't happen. We wanted to be face to face, but most of you chose to be online. Next year, let's try face to face because it would be so much nicer.
Thanks, Simon. Just before everyone goes, can I just add something? And that is a big thank you from me and the team that I work with for the time you've given today. I know there's been some really negative messages or sad messages, tragic messages, but there is lots of information, tools and support that we will be sending out to you. So these tools should help you to do the job that you want to do in a way that you feel works for you. So I hope you found it valuable, and thank you again for your time. Take care, everyone.
Thank you, Kerry and Zoe. It's nice to see the feedback in the chat as well. Thank you, Erica and Teresa and Andrea and Geeta. Thank you. I'll hang on as people leave. Thank you, Susan. And Mirella, great. I'm glad you found it useful. You know, we don't know what everybody's background is, but if as a social worker you found it useful, that's really helpful as well.
Yes, and to be honest, I'm a student social worker, so for me this was very, very informative.
Excellent, thank you. And Felista has backed that up, so that's great as well. Thank you. I'm going to hang on just in case anybody wants to ask anything, but I think we're pretty much. Oh, Mirella, and yeah, we will send it as a PDF to Deb. And Deb, I imagine we could send it out just to everybody who signed up. Should we do it that way around?
Yeah. I have put in the chat that we would do that, and also any links or information that have been put in the chat. And we've got the tools and the screening tools, which will also go out with the presentations.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Bye-bye. And there's a few people left. Leona, I don't know if you're hanging on to speak to us. Susan's one of yours, isn't she? Sometimes you'll find people, Debs, are left on the screen and you think, are they still there? But they've actually left. For some reason, Teams likes to leave a couple of people still on the screen. I think that's it now. I think we're the last ones left.
Okay, I'm just asking Sue Clark to turn the recording off.
Okay. Well, Debs, in that case, we can say goodnight. And then we got there in the end.
We did. Thank you ever so much, Si.
Good. Good.
Really helpful.
Well,
Sonia, there's your wondrous face.
Yeah.
Well, I was trying to keep it kind of to the side. I've been sending messages to Si all the way through, probably driving him mad. But I think it went. I felt like it went really positively actually after all the kind of departures and additions and all the stress that you had on Friday. So
And it almost felt like there was a plan there, because when Mike said you're going to do executive functioning, I was thinking, oh, thank God I put those slides in. So look, yeah, I think we could have extended it and spent more time. It would have been nice to break out so people could talk more freely, because I think the biggest problem with online is it's quite a lonely place to suddenly put your hand up and say something in small, people, and a lot of people
were conversing though. There was
Yeah.
a lot of comments, and
a lot of people are learning, so they haven't got the answer. They want to hear what the answer is, which is
I know, definitely. I'm just trying to, because my system crashed, and so I asked Sue to restart the recording. Oh, there we go. I think I've been able to stop it. There we go.
okay.